2030 time period. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Jose Hernandez. He's from Splunk. You guys don't say it like that, though.
No, I haven't heard it.
Okay, you just say Splunk. The Splunk security research team, he's going to be talking to you about honeypots and how to make them stickier and probably collect a lot of really cool data from attacks. Sounds like a thing.
Some lessons learned.
Thanks, everybody, and welcome, Jose.
Thank you. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's post their lunch coma at this point. I've had to drink a ton of coffee because I was falling asleep. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the lessons learned we had in the research team at Splunk, running honeypots on the wild, and what we're planning to do from there, and maybe share some of this with you, so you can probably try to execute it on your own environment. This was really fun, but you'll see why. So I was going to play an audio back from you guys. I got really annoyed. I've had my phone number for about 15 years now, and I get spam calls. There was a period of time I was getting spam call after spam because it got really annoyed. I got this RoboKiller app. It's garbage, don't get it. But it was really, really fun for about 2 weeks because it plays back a recording of your choosing, whatever recording, and the whole purpose of the app is to keep spammers on the phone listening to the recording that looks like an actual person, that sounds like an actual person having that conversation. And then they record that interaction, and then you can play it back on your phone. And so, if you can fool a human on the phone that a recording on the other end is an actual human, to me, it's the perfect example that honeypots do work, even on a human level, right? Imagine when you're fooling machines, which is probably, you can argue, probably easier to a certain extent. I'm not going to play the audio. I'll leave you guys up to if you guys want to. I'll upload the slides afterwards. So you can play the audio from there. It's pretty hilarious. We don't have a mic here, so. For the audio, quick rundown of the agenda. I'm going to introduce some ideas and introduce myself. I'll share a little bit of what we saw what we call the data challenge, right? Or what we call the data challenge when it comes to security. And then share a bit of the experience of what our first experiment was like, running honeypots on the wild. Then talk a little bit of what analysis methodology we ran through when we collected this data, and the reasonings behind that analysis methodology. And finally, I'll share with you, some of the work we've been doing as a next phase from this experiment, where we want to go with it. A little bit about myself. Actually, before I say anything about myself, this is my first time in Michigan, first time in GrrCON. This is amazing. I'm so impressed. You all have me at MechWarrior. The moment I saw those pods, I'm this is amazing. So, I'm a former Akamai Prolexic security architect, Akamai Prolexic, co-founder of SSH, which became, or is now, the Oracle WAF. And a long-time Splunker. Actually just returned after, the acquisition of SSH. I left actually and came back to Splunk, to do research. Splunk has, if you can afford the license, unlimited freaking indexing, and data is really king for a lot of the problems we work on. So it's a good place to solve these problems, and came back. And so, yeah, let me share with you again a little bit of what we've been up to. So first, before we jump into any solutions, let's talk about what the data challenge is, or with security specifically. Attacks today are when you're getting attacked, it's really hard from the tool sets out there today to really understand what techniques are getting used in that exploitation, right? To distill that, depending on the tool set you have and how you have yourself architected. It's never extremely obvious, and they're not really, most tools out there are built to protect you, not to understand what the attack has been doing, right? It's to either remediate it or collect some data out of it, right? Second, it's really hard to do attribution. Like Robert just was saying, it's really hard to do attribution. More importantly, not even digging into attribution. It's really to categorize or look at the context of an attack with regards to your specific network. Is something targeted at me, or is something hitting the entire world, right? Is this something that was at a targeted event or not? Is this a malware that got used on me specifically, or a specific set of people under my industry, individuals, or not? And thus, And so for the most part, again, we've used a bunch of products to try to answer some of this stuff, but they're not really built for that, I mean, for the most part, right? And so alongside, again, following this train of thought, in 2018, there was a Black Hack talk on, it's called like, Don't Eat Spaghetti with a Spoon. And one of this is like the last slide, or one of the last slides, like the takeaway points. And I'm highlighting up there, like to me, the one that like resonated the most was they found out, that taking open source intelligence feeds out of the box was twice as less effective as running your own honeypots for seeing net new attacks in the wild. What that means is this gentleman's running honeypot saw attacks twice as fast in their network than actually from threat intel feeds. And going back to, again, products and technologies, we lean into threat intel feeds heavily as an industry. And so, in a nutshell, threat intel for us doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So Jason, I just saw Jason's talk next door earlier, and he said something that really I'm still in my brain, I'm still digesting it. But basically, threat intel feeds, which is like 100% accurate. They're really good at looking at things that have already been known, but not things that you don't know yet that are hitting your environment, right? So known bad, not unknown bad. Now, why did we decide to use honeypots? Why did we even bother with this project to begin with? We at Splunk Security Research basically wanted to do a few things. First, we shipped this thing called the Security Content Update Pack. It's basically, think of like a free signature update in our SIM to our customers. And so in order for us to produce this pack, we got to write detections, right? For new malware, new exploits, new attackers. And so our intent behind this was, we wanted to lure in new attackers that we've never seen before, so we can write detections for. Specifically, things that were either topical or things that were interesting to us, or things that have hit one of our customers in the past that really maybe wasn't written about. Second, we wanted to be able to produce in some way programmatically this content packs. Right? We were spending a whole lot of time individually, each of us, like just reversing things, understanding how they work, so then actually generate a detection for our customers. And third, we really wanted to cover relevant attacks. And what I mean by that is sometimes what you see written on a news article is not necessarily what's hitting right now in the internet, right? Like, for example, Bluekeep. Bluekeep was hitting before even the article was out, right? That there was a new, the exploit. There were scans already happening, like a week before that, 2 weeks before that. That exploit was already written. So our goals walking into this was basically to collect malware, basically, in a nutshell, right? But more specifically, payloads from malware, and I'll study its connections and its behaviors when they hit a system. And again, we're tailoring this thing for what we wanted to collect. Second, we wanted to emulate and manipulate common system parameters to make to make our honeypots look like as close as possible a real system, if we could. And I'll explain to you why. Like, how do we reach that conclusion in a second? But we also want to ensure that whatever we ended up using to collect this information was easy enough for us to manage. We're a small team. We're not a big team. And so, in order for us to do this effectively, we wanted to deploy it across multiple cloud environments, multiple customers. So it needed to be something that was easy, fast to deploy and to customize. And finally, because, again, Splunk, and we're going to eventually analyze this inside Splunk, really needed to have something that allows us to have something like sane indexing, right? Like, we're normalizing data out of this box. We've been spending a bunch of time on it. It was a non-starter from a technology perspective. So we decided to start the experiment with Cowrie. And Cowrie, if you've never heard of it, is a SSH medium interaction honeypot. Actually a fork of Keeple. Old school SSH medium interaction honeypot. Cowrie is actually written by a current Splunker. And Cowrie emulates a real system. But it's all fake, right? When you almost like when you interact with it, you're running commands and stuff. You're not really actually running any commands. You're emulating that back to the attacker, and it records everything that attacker is doing on that box. So before I dig into what we did with Kauri and what data did we collect out of this and how we analyze it, I want to show you some before and afters. Like before we default install of Kauri, we just got it, we just started playing with it, and then after we've made a bunch of stuff, like we modified a bunch of stuff out of it. The first image here, so before is left-hand side, after is right-hand side, is the top countries that were hitting our sensors that we built, the Kauri sensors we built and we've deployed. So before we did anything to it, most traffic we were seeing against the sensors on SSH, again, was out of Russia. And then a bunch of other little countries in between, but like by far, Russia was like, so we were like, well, why? Started digging into the data, we were getting a bunch of garbage from Mirai, which is still around, still scanning the internet, and still infecting SSH endpoints with default credentials, which we had on this host. When we cleaned out all the Mirai traffic, and what I mean by clean out, in a second I'll show you, we basically stopped allowing authentications from things like default credentials that Mirai uses. We saw way more distributed attack surface that these honeypots were seeing. Right? Where the attackers were coming from all over the place, essentially. Another thing that, again, before the change and after the change that I found completely interesting was, before we made any modifications, we were roughly getting about, I don't know if you guys can see that, but about 80 connections a day or so. It was increasing during holiday season, but about 80 connections a day to all of our nodes. And about 20 of those actually resulted in the attacker interacting with the honeypot, right? So one thing is they actually connected to the SSH endpoint. The other thing is that they actually started inputting commands, dropping malware, doing whatever, right? When we made our modifications, that skyrocketed up. I mean, we jumped all the way to like, at some point that spike was like 500 connections, and roughly about 100 of them were actually resulted in interactions with them. Finally, from the before and after, which one, can you guys guess which one's is a before and which one's the after? So actually the right hand side now is the before. Before we made any modifications, we were getting roughly about 10 payloads or 10 malwares being collected on all of our sensors a day, 10, 15 or something like that. Spiked, after we made our modifications, we were receiving a lot more malicious stuff on this box. And this is what we wanted, right? We wanted to collect malware so we can then produce detections out of it. This is essentially the proof is in the pudding kind of slide, right? This is like whatever we ended up doing, right? It's a process of change. It resulted in, we are collecting a lot more bad stuff. We have better examples now that we can work through. This is so one of the things we were playing with as part of analyzing this data was we basically loaded up gray noise, and we wrote this custom command, gray noise. If you're not familiar with gray noise is basically a company that provides an API for sensors that they run. So they run a bunch of honeypots all over the world, and then you can query the data those honeypots are seeing through their API. And so we wrote a command in Splunk that pulls, basically can query their API and bring back data. And we analyzed what were basically the organizations that were hitting our honeypots the most, given what gray noise knows about, right? And by the most, it was kind of odd. Like when we saw this originally, we were like, this is odd data. We're like, Romania Communications, there's a lot of Comcast in there as well, Italy. Again, more akin with that. There wasn't necessarily a single attacker who was just hitting our box or our sensors, right? Our honeypot sensors. It was a very, very well spread attack. So, what do we do? Like, how do we respond? Like, what was it that we modified in our SSH honeypots to actually start collecting a lot more data and then translate it to detections? Well, before I jump into that, I want to show you a quick video of an actual attacker. Let me just play this back for you. Oh, no, never mind. I lost my mouse. I want to play so this video is a video of an attacker logged into one of our sensors. We were lucky enough to see it when it happened. So we started recording the session. And this is before we started doing any modifications, right? This is basically a plain vanilla Kari instance we just installed. So one of the things is, so this guy, the first thing is he's trying to get a lay of the land. He's listing directories, right? And so he goes to home, says, oh, there's only one user on the home directory, Richard. That's odd. Let me go back. Is there anything else in here? Just has like a regular, SSH profile, et cetera, et cetera. And then he's like, well, do I have a Kari user? He knew he was in a honeypot. Immediately, he noticed it, right? He noticed he was in a honeypot. He's like, is there a Kari home user in here? And so what does he do next? I'm out. I'm out. Like, I know this is a sensor. I'm not dropping anything in here. This is the reason why we started modifying Kari. We knew we weren't collecting anything useful, and this is again, the proof is in the pudding. This is our proof that what were we doing wrong was immediately what we started asking. What are we doing wrong? We can see what these attackers are actually doing on the box. Which again gets me to, let me go back. Sorry for that. Gets me to, what do we change? So Kari has a default config file. HC Kari says CFG. And in that default config file, you get, for example, a setting like hostname. And that's a dead giveaway. If you don't change your hostname in your machine and you're using the standard default honeypot hostname, your tag is going to jump out, right? So I had done that actually on that video. That was the only setting I think I ended up changing. But the not so obvious ones were things like the interactive timeout. Remember that chart I just showed you about the interaction versus connection and how it spiked up? That's because we realized that attackers would connect to the SSH session and sit there. Do nothing. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. And then they'll start launching the attack. Why? A lot of corporations close those SSH connections really fast. You don't want any resources just keeping somebody listening on a socket. So we increased the timeout to first it was 5 minutes, and then we went from like 180 seconds to then 5 minutes, and then I think we ended up making it like an hour at some point. And the longer we let the attacker sit there, typically the more data we ended up getting as a result, right? Other things were, because we were going, Kari as out of the box ships trying to emulate a Debian Lenny server, so an old school Debian server. We wanted to emulate an AWS Ubuntu 14.04 instance, and so in order for us to do that, we had to change the kernel build string. We had to change the actual SSH banner that comes back. All of those were telltale signs for the attacker where they would connect and say, well, hold on, I'm expecting an Ubuntu box, but you're getting me the build string for a Debian box. Something's odd. They're out. They don't drop the malware, right? Other not so obvious things, right, that this was lessons learned running this on the wild, was Kari has a user database. And there's a set of users. User database is, what you will do with that is, when whatever username lands on this database you have here, it will allow an attacker to log into it without any passwords. So under the hood, they'll put a password. Like when they connect, they'll put a password, but doesn't matter what they write, they'll be let in, right? So it's basically, hey, I'm going to allow this user to see if I can cache an attack under this user. So remember that first chart I showed you with Russia being all the traffic we got originally, then we cleaned it up afterwards. We denied admin. That's one of the most common Mirai attempted authentication accounts. And all the garbage went away. And I mean, we cleaned up some other stuff in there, but, other things that we did was, for example, we were seeing a lot of connections from the user PI. And because we didn't have it on this database, we would deny that connection. We're not allowing you in, so we're kicking, and so we're missing the malware that attacker was trying to drop. We changed that. We allowed the user PI, and we started seeing some really interesting stuff as a result. So another thing that again gave us a lot of value was just make sure if you do go through this process, you're looking at what users your attackers are attempting, and then adjust for that, right? Change your honeypot for that. Not the final, but I think the second most important thing that we ended up changing was the file system layout. So again, out of the box, Kari's Debian, completely different file system than Ubuntu 14.04. And so attacker jumps on, says, oh wait, this directory structure doesn't really match this operating system. I'm out. Kari has a very convenient tool called CreateFS that allows you to basically create an emulation of a file system out of the box you're sitting on. This is the command that I use to create a mimic of Ubuntu 14.04. But the coolest thing I found, this blew my mind, the coolest thing I found from this command was, if you pass it a -p at the end, not only do they emulate the full file system, they emulate everything under dev and proc. So all the devices on that machine are also emulated. Super useful. Because, again, now it looks like even more of a real machine. You have emulated devices on there, right? It's all fake in the sense of like, there's not actual devices, just empty text files where they come back, but that was pretty neat. And then the final one, I think, I left the best for last. The final most important part was the commands that we had available in Kari out of the box were not returning what you would expect the box to return. What do I mean by that? Kari, again, fully emulated environment, medium interaction, so it's not an actual environment, has pre-built text outputs for out-of-the-box Linux commands. So if you're logged into the server and you run dmesh, you're going to get some text output that me, or the defender, would have pre-programmed for that attacker. Well, some of those text outputs, again, were for Debian, not for Ubuntu. So if you did a mount, for example, you would see SDA. Well, man, this attacker's hitting an Ubuntu instance in AWS. So the default mount in AWS is XVDA, right? Not SDA. They give us the giveaways. A lot of crypto miners that we saw hitting us would run LSCPU. They want to see what CPU I have so they can actually mine. Well, guess what? If you don't have the right CPU for them, they're not even going to drop that miner. And so they're just going to hop out. So we modified all these commands essentially to return real outputs from the Ubuntu 14.04 box. And again, this helped us it invited a lot more attacks into our instances, which resulted in just way better data for us. It was so, I was a little bit blown back. This was on experiment for us, right? Like, this was not a project. Like, we just went to like, hey, how we're going to tackle this? We started thinking through a complete experiment. But this was almost like the moment where, you know, when you're experimenting, it just blows up in your face and you're like, it works, you know, kind of thing. This is the moment. We caught the malware was nothing to go home right about. It was an RSC bot, a Perl bot that got dropped. But we saw it 5 days before anybody uploaded it to VirusTotal. We saw it 5 days ahead of, again, any other researcher, essentially. And I'm just quantifying it out. But we saw it 5 days ahead. That's the value right there, right? If you're seeing something ahead of potentially what you will see in VirusTotal or any threat intel feed, you're ahead of the curve. And, by the way, this is running outside of perimeter, not a perimeter, like in the same ASNs and same accounts as our cloud provider. So if we're seeing it, that means all of our other servers are seeing it, right? So this is the stuff we got to worry about. This is what's scanning us, essentially. That was a fun day. So how do we break this data down? So like one thing is to run this Honeypot servers and get attack and see the attacker, but like you're going to want to do something with that data eventually. And so like, what are you after mentally when you're analyzing this data? Our goal was primarily, again, to build detections out of it. And more importantly, we're looking to build detections for net new things. So specifically, attacks that did not have proof of concept code out in the wild. Things that have not been known. But they were hitting either us individually or the entire internet. How do we answer that question? The first thing that we did was we searched for the rare files that were being dropped in Kari. Not the common files. Why? If you're scanning the internet, you have Bluekeep as an exploit, and now you're going to infect all the open RDP instances out there. You're likely so and a bunch of people are doing this because now the exploit is public. I don't care. I know that exploit is public. There's probably 10 write-ups on how that exploit works, and most vendor already have signatures and analysis for that. I can just look at one of those write-ups and reverse it and bake it into the product. So I want to look at, again, the stuff that it's not common in the industry. So look at the rare, or not common out being exploited. Just look at the rare files. But the next question we were asking ourselves was, is this in VirusTotal or is this in the public domain? So if there was a malware drop, take the hash, say, hey, run it against VirusTotal and see if there's a report for it. We had this one-liner. It's not pretty, but it works. That basically just lists all the hashes that have been downloaded into your sensor, then filters out just CRUD and submits it into the VirusTotal for analysis, for reporting, using the command line interface. And then we obviously sleep because VirusTotal rate limits you to 4 requests per second unless you're paying them actual money, which we should, but anyway, we weren't in this case. So if it wasn't in the public, so going back to the analysis methodology, is it rare? Okay, it's rare. Awesome. Is it in the public domain? If it's not in the public domain, if it is, we're done. We're not interested in this. Or we already know what it is. There's a VirusTotal report for it. We can probably find more information about it. We're not necessarily interested in it for further analysis. But if it's not, was it seen by gray noise? And what this tells us is, we saw it, our Honeypot sensor saw it, but gray noise, which has, again, this is what they do for a living, did not. Which most likely means we were either individually targeted or there was something specific about what this Honeypot was running in that made them attack it versus just scanning the internet for it and hitting a gray noise node. And like I mentioned earlier, we built a custom command for gray noise that we can just, through Splunk, hit that, right? So we're just like, hey, we were indexing on the Honeypot data pipe, get me the data from gray noise, and bringing that back. So rare, it's not in the public domain, and is not hitting anybody else except my Honeypot, as far as I know. And what do we do next? Is there proof of concept code out there for this attack? If there's proof of concept code out there, excellent. I know it's rare, it's hitting us individually, and I know what the code, I know what this exploit is doing. I also have now collected it in our sensors. I know its behavior when it works. I can write a detection for this. Amazing. Great. This is exactly the state we want to be at. This is where our researchers go from studying something to actually, again, affecting our users, getting them to be a little bit more secure if we can ship that out for them. If there is no proof of concept exploit, also amazing. Now I know what to hunt for. Nobody else has seen it. Right? So we have a bit of like a hunting process when there is no proof of concept code publicly. We basically put a Yara rule up in VirusTotal, a hunting rule. When it matches, it will submit. There's a process that submits this writes this into Splunk, but Splunk automatically submits it into VMRay, the sandbox. VMRay explodes it, looks at all its behavior. All that data also gets indexed back into Splunk. We reanalyze that data, and now we can actually write a detection from that exploitation, right? From that behavior analysis, from the sandbox exploitation. Plus, we also have all the data that we collect in the Honeypot. So not only do we know what it does when it infects you, but also we know how is it targeting you, right? From data in the Honeypot. So that's basically what we use for analysis. 1, 2, 3, 4. We kept doing that. Every payload, every day we show up, we will show up to work. All right. What do we got? What do we fish today? What do we catch? Right? It's almost like going fishing every morning, right? We casted a net. We built a bunch of sensors. Every morning we built a bunch of sensors for what we wanted to catch. Next day we come around like, what do we catch? All right, let's analyze it. What was interesting? All right, this is what we got to write detections for. Now we had a workflow. Right? Something that started off as an experiment became a workflow for us to build detections. The next step is, how can I do this faster? But we'll get to that in a second. What did we learn, first off? Let me just really quickly recap what the learning exercise was and going through this workflow a few times afterwards. First, like you saw in the video, some actors just knew they were in a honeypot. They just knew it. They because we made a mistake in the way things were configured, or we learned something that we didn't know how to configure, but some knew and they just hopped off. Second thing we learned was, the longer we took to analyze something, the more worthless it became, or the less useful it became. What do I mean by that? Again, let's take back the Pearl bot. Because we caught it 5 days in advance, we were able to build the detections 5 days before anybody else knew in the public domain that this was a thing, which means our customers now can get a detection sooner. And the other reason timing is key is if an attacker knows he's being exposed, right? There's public reports about this. Guess what he's going to do? He's going to burn his C2, move on. You lost him. So can't sit on this stuff for too long. When I say too long, I mean like a week is too long already. So we learned that we needed to improve how fast we analyze this stuff. Right? This going through that workflow, that 1, 2, 3, 4, needed to be almost as automated as possible. Last thing we learned is we were dropping data. We were leaving data on the table. We were not collecting everything we wanted to with an SSH honeypot because by its nature, we were not hosting any applications. It was just a SSH service. We weren't hosting Drupal. We weren't hosting anything like WordPress or a database as public or Splunk even as public Splunk instance. So we knew that the next thing we wanted to do to, again, continue this experiment was cache application-specific, the application layer of the attack, and application-specific attacks as well, not just the SSH service. So, enter clap. And this is why I'm not in marketing, by the way. They let me call it clap. I mean, I'm surprised. But either way, it stands for kernel log application. And the reason it's kernel log application mainly is because of Sysdig, but we'll get to Sysdig in a second. What is clap? Clap is, first off, it's a real operating system. Nothing is emulated. Real OS. That has its pros and its cons. Pro, we no longer have to do this whole, I need to fake a command for the attacker because we don't have the command, or I have to fake the data for the attacker. No, you're infecting a real system. This is the real deal, my friend. Come hack it. Right? Come deploy your malware here. There's a con to that. You're giving the attacker an infected system, or you're letting him infect the system. Clearly for research purposes here, but you still need to go clean that up because they can pivot off of your system and do all the bad things, and you don't want that. You're going to get in trouble, right, as a result. But second, I mentioned Sysdig. I love Sysdig. I'm a Sysdig fanboy. If you're not familiar with Sysdig, Sysdig is like if somebody took TCP dump, Wireshark, dtrace, strace, and audit D, smash it onto one giant beautiful tool. Sysdig sits at the kernel level of the operating system. It can see everything that's happening at the kernel level of the OS. What does that mean? It sees our network. Everything goes, every network packet goes to the kernel. Every application call. So everything, basically every kernel call that any userland application is making. And as well as again, because it's also seen at the kernel level, it's also seeing all the behaviors from the operating system. Logs being written by different applications in the OS, so on and so forth. It's almost like having God mode visibility on the OS to a certain extent. Falco, so we use Sysdig, before I jump into Falco, we use Sysdig to collect, one thing that Sysdig does is it allows you to write the information is seen on the kernel to a thing called like SCAP. Again, think of PCAPs to a certain extent if you're not familiar with it. But basically a capture file of everything that happened in the operating system. So you can write it to a file and then read it back in some other system, right? You can move it off there and read it back in some other system. So Falco, developed by the same company that writes, that built Sysdig, both are open source, by the way. There's a software behind, they sell a cloud service, but both tools are open source. Falco sits on top of Sysdig and implements rules, like detection rules, for everything that's happening on the kernel. So, if your attacker is messing, for example, he's dropping a rootkit and he's messing with binaries, like changing the way binaries behave, Falco will detect that and can alert you. Where Sysdig sees that, Falco has a rule checking, hey, are any binaries being modified consistently? And then when one matches, it alerts you. Finally, applications, or application was the other thing we want to layer on top of this honeypot, right? We were leaving that in the table, so we want to be able to support mimicking applications on our systems. And so, because we have a real operating system, we don't have to fake anything. We can literally just install anything we wanted and pre-configure it to a log and see how an exploit got in, right? And finally, we wrote this thing called like an S3 bucket sync. We wrote basically a sync tool. Tool is like really giving it way too much credit. It's like a one-liner. But what it does is very important to the functionality of Clap, which is We use sysdig to write captures to the kernel. The S3 sync tool pulls that back out of the system and into a bucket that we only have access to. That write function, that's only the creds that we basically put in the honeypot can only write. You can't list items on the bucket. You can't get items from the bucket. You can only dump stuff into the bucket. So if, God forbid, an attacker realizes that we have the sync tool and they get the bucket URL, all they can do is basically dump a bunch of garbage in there. Which is okay. We can just rotate the bucket URL and life is good. And then delete the garbage. But at a high level, I'm a visual person, so I roll like a quick diagram for this. This is what the architecture kind of looks like. You have an attacker who will exploit an application, take your typical WordPress, Drupal, so on and so forth application. Once he exploits it, for example, let's use like a remote code execution. He finds a remote code execution in an application to drop malware, and we'll have sysdig sitting on that box, listening to everything that's happening and writing captures of everything that's happening on the box. So sysdig will see the network traffic, sysdig will see how he exploited it, and sysdig will also see the events that got generated as a result of that. Falco has rules based on what sysdig is seeing, and it serves as an early warning system for us. Going back to, you guys remember, analysis timing is key? That's how we sped that up. We basically wired Falco to send us a Slack message, and we have this team channel. They're like, hey, this honeypot is being tampered with. Now we know which honeypot to look at immediately. We don't know what they did. We don't know what's getting done in there. But at least we know which one's getting messed with, and we know which one we got to rebuild. And that way we can jump on it right away. So research becomes almost to a certain extent operational. Finally, the sync tool is grabbing all those capture files that sysdig is writing and pulling it back into an S3 bucket that then we have access to. That way we can burn the machine when the attacker, or we think the attacker is done. We can burn the machine, but we still keep the data that they generated to build detections out of. And that's the idea behind Cloud, essentially. Real machine, fully emulated application, using sysdig and Falco under the hood. Falco is our early warning system for us, and sysdig to collect data, and then we pull everything out for analysis. And I just explained the analysis methodology behind it. Although with Clap, it's a little bit different. Why? Because we have sysdig. Sysdig has this beautiful thing, and it really is beautiful, like, called chisels. And chisels is nothing more than a filter applied to the sysdig data. Think of like Nmap, NSE scripts, if you're familiar. Like just pre-built scripts, basically, that operate on top of sysdig to query its data. Now, why are chisels amazing from an analysis standpoint? With the chisel, simple chisel, you can grab all the system logs. I no longer have to put a Splunk forwarder or a file B forwarder or any kind of forwarder and compromise that. I can do it offline after I've burned down the machine, because I know that machine is infected, and read all its logs for analysis. But not only can you query logs, or can you pull logs out of a capture file, you can also look at all the TCP connections. Like literally, again, you can extract capture files out of this if you wanted to look at stuff in the network layer. Top connections, if you wanted to see easily like what's getting extradited out of the box. Sysdig also has a breakdown for all HTTP communication, requests and responses. HTTP log, super simple and straightforward. This is one of the coolest ones. List login shells. Sysdig, again, seeing everything on the kernel, not only does it know what shells are logged in, but it gives you all the commands being typed on that shell. So I know every command that attacker typed while he was hacking the box. Very cool. Very useful. Finally, the final example I want to share with you is Spyport. Hey, you need TCP dump out of the box? Like, you need TCP dump out of the box? This is pretty much it. Spyport gives you all the network traffic for a specific port from a capture file. Again, this is not on a live system. This is post-tense after we've burned the box and, we've already seen the attack. It makes Batman cry, basically. I think you see it from a tools perspective. It's so useful. I did mention, right? I mentioned that Falco has, we wired it up for Slack, right? And this is what the Slack alerts kind of look like. Imagine if somebody was editing, itsy bad file. You get an alert in Slack. Hey, Mr. Researcher, this honeypot just got tampered with. Let's rebuild it. With all set, let me show you a quick demo. So I'm going to preface this demo with, we're not releasing Collapse code yet. We're only releasing a sample of the code. We don't feel ready yet to release it. But this is a demo of the sample code we're releasing. And the other thing I want to make a note of before I show you the demo is going back to that point of ease of use and speed of building. We've rewired Collab to be built using Terraform and Ansible. So all of this, the build process for Sysdig, Falco, et cetera, is now done by Ansible as playbooks. And using Terraform, we can easily deploy swath of collapse across multiple cloud providers. Hey, I need to study the latest WordPress vulnerability, or I want to study WordPress vulnerabilities across AWS, GCP, and Azure. 15 minutes later, we have a bunch of sensors all over the place for that. So we can easily tailor them and then deploy them. And again, the idea is to do this almost on a weekly basis or per whatever attack we want to study. Let me pull up that demo really quick. So, again, collapse sample, because we're not releasing the fourth thing yet, but here's a quick example of like what the build process looks like. So, literally Terraform apply, like I mentioned earlier. The machines itself, we're just orchestrating the builds with Terraform. It goes out there. Not only does it build, it builds a full-blown VPC. This one's actually operating off of AWS right now. So it builds a full-blown VPC with all the security groups, allowing whatever ports you need. In this instance, I'm trying to emulate the same thing as we were doing with Kauri, right? We kind of like continue that experiment. So builds your firewall rules, the subnets for that region, that availability zone, outbound access for that attacker. So in case he wants to extradite anything from the honeypot, hey, you have an outbound route. Please go for it. Let me know where you're talking to, so I can know I can know which C2s to shut down, right? Or what's your drop site? Builds an instance, applies a public IP to that instance, and now you have a honeypot out in the public internet running out of AWS essentially. And again, going back from the work we did with Kauri, when we're trying to emulate some of that with cloud, right? Just it's version 1. We put as a variables file in Ansible, you can put any username you want to capture traffic for in SSH, and we did some magic under the hood with PAMD, and any login will be allowed under that user. So, for example, under the Postgres user here, if you try to SSH using our sample, it will just, no matter what the password is, we'll just let that attacker in. Oh, by the way, that password also gets captured. It's part of the honeypot logs. So, and again, just imagine this is an attacker messing with things. They're dropping now a shell, right? They're logged in. They're dropping a shell, running a bunch of commands, and just generating noise here. But under the hood, Sysdig is capturing all of this, right? It's running on the kernel, capturing everything that's happening. And so you're going to see in a second the analysis of, actually, I'm going to jump up to another box where the collection is happening so I can show you what the syncing process looks like out of the box. The syncing process today is not ideal. I'm going to warn you. It's using cron, and it's a simple, very dumb, again, cron job that just syncs everything that's getting collected by Sysdig up to an S3 bucket. That, again, I didn't go home right about, but it works. And if an attacker, again, gets a hold of whatever the bucket is, we can always rotate it. Credentials only allow you to write. We always rotate credentials in that case. But we will know if they did because we have all the commands they ran. Our researchers on our end, we sync that data back down, and then we start analyzing it with Sysdig. We're now actually working on other things. We're not ready to release this yet. We want to build scripts that will automatically run all those Sysdig chisels and get that data and index it into Splunk, so we can just build a nice, pretty dashboard with all the data that we collected. We're not there yet, but That's kind of the goal. The next two steps. Here is a spy user Chisel from the capture file, and I'm grabbing from here. I'm filtering for here. So you remember that I typed the first thing I did when I logged into the box was my malicious script here or whatever. You see that command from the capture file in sysdig, right? So again, we can analyze everything that attacker did, everything he typed on that shell. So that's spy users. Spy users gives you basically all the users' interaction broken down by user. Spy logs gives you all the raw logs on that box, every raw log written on that system, which is awesome. Without any agents on it. You have a bunch of other stuff that you can run, right? Like there's like I mentioned, list login shells. There's stuff like if you're running containers, there's more stuff you can look into, like see if like, they're trying to do like container escapes and see what they're getting hooked into for that kind of stuff. Now here I'm listing the login shells, for example, the different PIDs for the login shell, and then you can query what those PIDs did as well. Top connections. Actually, this is a pretty neat one for like if you want to see if your attacker is extraditing data and what port and what they're extraditing to. It's from top connections, and I'm sorry he's getting cut out, but clearly it's an SSH honeypot, so top connection is going to be SSH inbound, which is what you're seeing there. So yeah, I think that's it for that. So that's an example of, again, how less than like a minute or two, we build a honeypot sensor in AWS, and it was already collecting data. I showed you how you can analyze some of the data out of the box, and I showed you some of the power that you get with sysdig. If for whatever reason, you cannot use sysdig, another good alternative, not perfect, but another good alternative is OS query. The reason it's not perfect is sysdig is not query based, right? It's always listening and it's always capturing. OS query is querying the OS internals, storing that in an in-memory database, and then you've got to query that out. So it's a good alternative if you can't, for whatever reason, run sysdig. Sysdig does this, by the way, as a kernel, it injects a kernel module. So that's how I was doing that collection. So, some takeaways for us and for you. High interaction honeypots are the way to go. I think it wasn't necessarily a mistake, but it was a lesson learned from us, not to use medium interaction or anything like that. We spent a lot of time trying to tailor that medium interaction environment to make it palatable for the attacker. Meanwhile, we could have just ran a real box and it would have been so much easier. So high interaction honeypots, the way to go. Honeypot data can be as valuable as threat intelligence. The proof was in the pudding. We were seeing stuff way early that we will show in open source threat intel feeds. I'm not saying threat intel is useless at all. There's actually really, really great threat intel providers out there, but this gives you a whole other set of visibility, and sometimes is as good or better than threat intelligence for being able to build detections into your organization. If you're going to mimic an environment, it pays off to spend time modifying it. If you're going to take any honeypot today available out of the box and you put it in the internet, it's next to useless. That's the experience at least we have with Cowrie. It was not giving us any useful data at the moment we installed it. When we started tinkering with it, modifying it, boy, did we get to good stuff back. Another point that we learned was when we started building the Terraform logic and Ansible, our speed to collection just went through the roof. So infrastructure as code is speed. And speed means better data, better detections. Better data means better detections, essentially. So, I mean, I can't speak highly enough of like, if you're going to do this kind of stuff, do use infrastructure. Don't build your honeypots by hand. It's going to be painful. You're going to make mistakes. It's not worth it. Make it as infrastructure as code. And finally, analysis timing is key. And I mentioned earlier the reasonings behind that, right? The longer you wait, the more time you're giving that attacker to just burn that environment and move on. The longer you wait, the more likely you're not going to be able to collect that data you need out of it, or you make use of the data you collected. If you wanted to get started, this is the GitHub repo where the example code is. The installation steps are pretty straightforward. I kind of just wanted to list them here for you. Literally install Terraform, install AWS CLI, put some creds for AWS in there, and you're set. You're ready to go. Any questions, comments, suggestions? Please. Sure. We had so the question is, do we had a lot of attackers that came back, or they just waited? We had a lot of, but we ended up seeing a lot of like things just scanning the internet and being opportunistic. We did have 2 occasions where things were just targeting us specifically. And that was, again, this is the reason we wanted to do this to begin with, right? But a lot of, I would say like 80% of the attacks we captured were just internet-wide attacks. So stuff not necessarily not being talked about, but happening in the internet consistently. So, of course. Questions? Comments? All right. Thank you very much.